Brilliant, thanks Adam. I've asked Jenny to just help me out a little bit this morning, so she's going to start off by reading Daniel chapter 8 to us. So if you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 8, Jenny's going to help us out.
Okay, Daniel's vision of a ram and a goat. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam, and in the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the 2-horned ram I'd seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and the sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and the truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man, and I heard a man's voice from Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified, and I fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the king of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nations and will not have the same power. In the latter part of the reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings have been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, if you thought last week's chapter 7 was a little bit intense, today we're continuing in a bit of a similar vein this morning. Last week we saw some horrible histories, didn't we? As Goff was looking at seeing in the dark. And it can feel like we're living in a pretty dark world at times. And I've called the talk this morning, Horrible Histories 2. Appalled but not overwhelmed. It sounds like that could be a movie title, doesn't it? But Horrible Histories 2, because just as last week we saw dark troubling history, we're not yet left without hope. We've heard, haven't we, about this morning, he's Lord of all. And there's hope to be found in Daniel's visions. We're building on last week, what we looked at in terms of these visions, this strange imagery that we're seeing in the book of Daniel, these prophetic messages about the future. And Goff gave us some really helpful keys last week to help us just in terms of how we handle this kind of apocalyptic writing, these visions, these dreams, some keys as to what the different parts mean. And we're going to build on that this morning as we see some similar themes in chapter 8. It's big, it's dramatic. At times it's pretty overwhelming reading these words. And I know I can be a little bit guilty myself of kind of getting a bit overwhelmed by this stuff and thinking, I don't really understand that. Right, let's skip ahead to the good stuff or move on to the next part, skipping over the bits that seem a little bit strange and a little bit intense. Instead of just allowing there's some really helpful truths here. There's some really helpful truths in these passages that we can allow to permeate into our hearts as we recognize there is a God who's Lord over all, who knows history. He knows everything that's going to happen, however horrible it might be. And rather than getting stuck in the here and now, I need to set my mind on the things ahead, the things in future, and know that God's in control. As we look at this together, I want us to see this passage isn't meant to confuse us or scare us. It's not just for people with PhDs. I certainly do not have a PhD in anything. Full disclosure, I'm not standing up here this morning as an expert in any way. And it can be easy with this stuff to end up getting really lost in all the details, trying to decode every horn, every beast. What does it mean? What does every number mean? You could spend hours, if you wanted to, this evening watching YouTube videos, analyzing all the different interpretations of these visions in Daniel. But there is a simple message within it that I believe we can all understand this morning. God's people might suffer, but his kingdom endures. He is Lord of all, and nothing surprises God. Nothing at all. He's sovereign. And these glimpses that we see in these visions, they're meant to build our faith. They're meant to give us hope and ultimately lead us to worship, to help us to live well in the present. We've started to see some different patterns in the book of Daniel. We've seen all the way back in chapter 2, there was the big tall statue, wasn't there, with the different parts representing 4 different kingdoms. Last week in chapter 7, we saw the 4 beasts, and now we've got this ram and goat. What's all that about? There's patterns here. There's a pattern of deteriorating attitude to God and his law on the part of pagan kings. People mess up. People rule badly. People try and exercise control and oppress those who are weaker than them. We've got this image of a beast. It's animal-like. It's not lacking any human emotion, no human kindness. Some of you might have heard of the Bible Project. Has anyone heard of the Bible Project? It's an amazing resource. It's got loads of brilliant illustrated videos for every single book of the Bible. You can go and watch them, and it unpacks different themes that different chapters and passages and books of the Bible contain. It's really helpful for personal study, for seeing how different things link together. It's really good to use in life groups. There's a great one for the book of Daniel, and actually I'd really recommend going back and watching it as we're at this point towards the end of our series, just to see how a lot of the different things that we've studied and explored over the last few weeks and months fit together, and the different themes that come through. And in the Bible Project, they draw out this idea of patterns and promises that we see in the book of Daniel. Just to quote what they say the pattern reveals how humans and their kingdoms become violent beasts. We saw that quite literally in Daniel 4. When they glorify their power and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel's visions also hold out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He'll rescue his world and his people and bring his kingdom. It's good news. The vision in Daniel 8, it is appalling. There's no denying it. There's no getting around it. It's an appalling vision that Daniel sees. He's actually, did you see at the end? He's sickened by it. It's literally made him physically ill seeing this vision. He's in bed for several days. He's ill. And when we start to unpack what this vision involves and what it contains, it's not really that surprising that it's had this impact and it's had this effect on Daniel. He was shown just enough of the contours of the future to understand what would happen to his people in the course of history. It was going to be terrible in the extreme. The times to come, there were going to be terrible times ahead for God's people. And that's why he felt overwhelmed. There would be terrible times ahead, but ultimately, God's people must endure knowing that he rules over it all. He is Lord over it all. The Lord knows the trials that await. And if he knows the trials, then his people can patiently endure with an assurance that his will is done and his kingdom will endure. He's sovereign. We might be appalled by this, by some of what we see, but we don't have to be overwhelmed. We're going to look at three key ideas this morning. Firstly, we've got powers that be for now. Kingdoms rise and fall. No matter how powerful they seem, human empires do not last. We're going to look at persecution for a while. Suffering is real, but it's temporary. God's people will face hardship, but God is still in control. And finally, we're going to look at the purposes of God for eternity. His purposes will stand forever. His kingdom is eternal, and his victory is certain. So firstly, let's look at powers that be for now. As you see in chapter 8, it starts with a bit of a timestamp at the beginning. We're 2 years on after chapter 7, the third year of the new king's reign. And this chapter is focusing on the beasts 2 and 3 from chapter 7. We've got the ram and the goat. Okay, this is a really striking prediction of what is going to happen, of what is going to come ahead. And it's helpfully explained to us as it's interpreted later in the chapter. We've got the Medo-Persian and the Greek empires. So it says in verse 20 that the ram with 2 horns is the Medo-Persians. And then in verse 21, we've got this goat on the move. It says it's the king of Greece. And we know that's the king of Greece was Alexander the Great. He was a really swift, fast king in terms of the way he conquered a whole vast area of land. He did it remarkably swiftly. It took him just 10 years to conquer this big, vast area. And that's what it's talking about here, this king of Greece. And if you'll see, the goat has the 4 horns that come out. And as Goff explained to us last week, horns, they represent power. And the 4 horns, actually, Alexander the Great's kingdom, when he died, was split amongst 4 different rulers. 4 generals divided his kingdom into 4 parts. It's remarkably accurate, this writing that was written before all of this happens, in terms of what's going to come ahead. It's so accurate, in fact, that some kind of more liberal scholars, they start to question, well, was this book actually written at the time it was written? Because it doesn't seem even like plausible, kind of forgetting that it's God who is in control of time and history, and he knows exactly what is going to happen. But as we look at this, it's amazing how accurate some of this writing is. And then we've got this little horn, this kind of subsequent beast in verse 9. And most scholars believe, and Goff mentioned this guy's name last week, that this is Antiochus Epiphanes. We heard a little bit about him last week. The atrocities that he committed against the Jewish people were really, really very, very brutal. They were utterly horrific as he persecuted Jews. He went by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Apparently, I read the Jewish dissenters, actually it was good to know that they had a little bit of a sense of humor because they called him Antiochus Epimanes. So they punned his name, Epiphanes, to Epimanes, which literally means crazy or madman. He was a complete madman, and he brutally persecuted the Jewish people. In verse 11, it talks about the daily sacrifice being forbidden and the sanctuary desecrated. And this is what Antiochus did. He desecrated the temple, this king. He forbade Sabbath observance. He actually brought an end to the morning and evening sacrifices that would have happened in the Jewish temple every day. And he took things to a whole new level. No king had done that before, to say, no, you can't make your daily sacrifices. And then he went further. As we heard last week, he sacrificed a pig on the altar to Zeus. And he got this pig's blood and he splattered it all around the temple. He was desperate to defile everything that the Jews held dear. So there's astonishing accuracy here as we see this horrible history. Remember, these are still, they're glimpses into the future. There's something big at work. We see in verse 10, it's cosmic. It talks about starry hosts of heaven. It's spiritual. In verse 24, it says it's not by his own power. There's a sense that there's some bigger force and power at work. And as we saw last week, there are bigger powers behind evil. The conflicts that we see in the world, they're not just political or economic, they're deeply spiritual. There's an enemy still at work, but Jesus has already won the decisive victory. I feel challenged. How spiritually awake am I to the fact that there are spiritual forces at work, knowing that actually we're in a spiritual battle? But when we see that there's governments or leaders oppressing God's people, when evil seems like it's winning, because it can do sometimes, certainly would have done for the Jews living in the time of Antiochus. Daniel 8 reminds us that God isn't surprised or absent. He knew what was going to happen before it happened. He's in control. He allows history to unfold, but he is still in complete control. He is still Lord of all. And we see persecution for a while, which is my second point. And Antiochus Epiphanes is this guy's name. And he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. You might recognize that phrase, epiphany. Epiphanes means God manifest. This king was saying, actually, not only am I a king, I'm God. He was calling himself God. He was saying, I'm God manifest. And he was the first of these kings to actually record his claim to divinity on his coins. He was so anti-God. He was saying he was God himself. He was anti-God, anti-Christ. And John tells us in his letter that there's been antichrists through the ages. Okay, remember what we talked about last week? We don't want to get bogged down in the details thinking, who could that be the antichrist? Are they an antichrist? We don't want to start guessing. These are just glimpses. But it says here in 1 John 2:18 that there are antichrists and that the antichrist is coming. It says, "Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the antichrist is coming, even now many antichrists have come." As you have heard that the antichrist is coming, even now many antichrists have come. This is kind of how we know it's the last hour. Biblically speaking, we're in the last hour. We're in the end times, that time in between the first and the second coming of Christ. Are we living in the end days? Yes, we are. It's now. We've had Pentecost. God's Spirit has been poured out on all flesh. We're living in the last days. And persecution is not just a thing of the past. It's as real for the church today as it was for Jesus' first followers. It's the reality. Every day, millions of Christians are being persecuted for their faith. Every day around the world, facing opposition, discrimination, and even death, simply for being a follower of Jesus. I think I've got a map, hopefully, that could come up to show for us. Not that one. A few more slides on. There we go. There's a map that just shows for us some of the countries in the world where they're facing really heavy and extreme persecution. That this is a great resource, Open Doors. I think Goff showed a children's passport last week from Open Doors, a really helpful resource for helping children and others just to pray for these Christians that are being persecuted in different ways. Do you look at it and be informed about the persecution that is happening. It's so humbling and challenging and important to be aware of and to pray for these people. In Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban, they're actively hunting down believers. They're checking phones for Bible apps and Christian messages. There's a really severe risk being a Christian in that country. They face interrogation, execution, real threats for those who have faith in Jesus. In Nigeria, the persecution of Christians has reached devastating levels. More believers are killed for their faith in Nigeria than in all other countries in the whole world combined. Millions have been displaced, forced from their homes, and left to endure desperate conditions with little hope of returning. And then there's obviously others on the list as well, but right at the top, North Korea. It's estimated that there's 300 to 500,000 believers in North Korea, which is quite amazing, really, I think. They're living under one of the most oppressive regimes on earth. Simply owning a Bible can earn a lifetime imprisonment in a labor camp or execution. These are just a few examples. Globally, more than 380 million Christians face high levels of discrimination and persecution. That's 1 in 7 believers worldwide. The risks are great. The price is high for these people. Through it all, the church endures. And indeed, it's even growing in these nations. God's church endures. It's incredibly humbling to hear about these places, I find. I'm challenged. We've got it so relatively comfortable in the West. It's really very humbling. So what we're seeing is that this idea that there's been many antichrists, okay? That people that are anti-God, persecuting and oppressing. But there'll also be the antichrist. Remember what Goff said last week? Be careful, don't speculate, be humble. These are glimpses, don't get lost in controversies. But as we look at this passage in Daniel 8, it's kind of hard to resist the impression that something much more distant and much more sinister than Antiochus is in view. In verse 17, it talks about the time of the end. This is way later than when Antiochus would have been around. And it's kind of entirely plausible and possible that this prophetic writing can be talking about two different things at the same time. Prophetic writing often does this. And Antiochus is but one prototype of what shall happen in the future. John Lennox writes, the prophecies of Daniel 2, 7, and 8, and also, as we shall see, 9 and 11, all home in on this final manifestation of evil government that shall be destroyed by the coming of Christ. That means that we've got several perspectives on that. Last week, Goff talked about mountain ranges, and kind of as we're looking at these things ahead in the future, it's like looking at different mountain ranges. You can't quite get the whole image. You can't see all the contours and the gaps between them. And another helpful image that John Lennox uses is he talks about astrophotographers. So apparently when an astrophotographer is taking images of space and the different stars, to get the complete image, to get the whole picture, what the astrophotographer does is they take 3 separate images through 3 different color filters, red, green, and blue filters. And these filters are then combined together. And it's only when these kind of filters are laid over the top of each other and are combined together that the stunning colored photograph is fully revealed. And I found this such a helpful way of understanding this. In Daniel's visions, we get separate images, but through collecting them together, we can begin to get a composite of the whole, to see what lies ahead. And Paul talks about this in 2 Thessalonians, this idea of the power of lawlessness. And Paul in Thessalonians, he writes it in everyday language, which is good. He's not writing to PhD academics here when he's writing to the church in Thessalonica. He's actually writing to new Christians. These people have recently become Christians, and he's already writing to them and talking to them about some big, heavy stuff. It's a reminder to us that this isn't stuff just to dismiss. This is stuff that we can all learn from. He says in 2 Thessalonians, "The secret power of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who now holds it back will continue to do so till he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming." The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve a lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. When we read this, it's kind of natural to kind of wonder, well, how long? How long is this going to go on for? This is awful, right? This is really awful. This is Satan's last fling, this great tribulation, not because he's winning, but because he's already lost. And if you remember last time, we looked at this idea of time, how long things are going to last for. We talked last time about times, and half a time. God helped us to explore that. And here we get time again. It talks about 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. This helps us to understand that this persecution is a limited time fixed by God. The 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. Some scholars would say that's, if you half that, because you've got your morning and your evening sacrifice, 2 a day, half of 2,300, according to my maths, 1,150, which was about 3.5 years. And that was actually the time taken to cleanse the temple after the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus. But the key thing I want us to draw and see from that is persecution for a while. There is a fixed time. It's not just going to go on forever. God has got a fixed time where persecution will end. Sometimes we can look at the world and we can see the suffering. We can hear about the persecution of Christians, see suffering in the world, and we can look and we can despair at the wars and the injustices. We can think, how long? But in Daniel 8, we're seeing here there is a limit. There is a fixed time. History is not out of control. God has set limits, even on the worst of rulers. We can have assurance. Hard times are not going to last forever. We've seen Daniel being appalled, but we can be not overwhelmed. Why don't we have to be overwhelmed? God's people might suffer, but his kingdom endures. One day, he will confront the beast. He will rescue his people and bring about his kingdom. We can endure and trust in his sovereignty. It says in John 16, verse 33, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." It all feels quite heavy, doesn't it? But there's more. Thankfully, we don't have to end there. Daniel, literally, that's it, done. I'm glad that I don't have to just get down this morning and leave it at that entirely. Because we've got the purposes of God for eternity. In verse 27, at the end, Daniel was made sick. He was worn out by his vision. He doesn't see what we have seen. He's got just a few pieces of the puzzle. We've got a bigger picture. He didn't know anything about the church that we've talked about this morning, the body of Christ. He's told to seal up the vision. History remains for him a sealed book. He's left wondering what's going to happen. We get to skip to the end. We get to see the full picture. I don't know about you, but there's been times where I've been reading a really good book and I've just had to have that little sneaky peek at the end of the story to see what's coming up. Maybe you've done that as well. We get to do that this morning. We get to look to the end. We don't have to just leave it as being completely overwhelmed and sick, like Daniel in this chapter. In 1 Peter, chapter 1, verse 10, Peter is writing to Christians who are suffering, who are going through hardship. And he talks about this idea that actually more stuff is now revealed to us. He talks about the prophets who spoke about the grace that was to come to you, how they searched intently and with the greatest care, trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that would follow. Verse 12, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves but you when they spoke of the things that have been told you by those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. Even angels long to look into these things. We get to see this full picture that even angels long to look into. Daniel had a partial view. The Old Testament prophets just had glimpses, but we get to see more. Have you seen? Have you been amazed? Who is it that's in charge of history? It's Jesus. He came as light into our darkness. The Messiah, the promised one. He came to seek and save people who were lost. Have you seen him? Do you know him this morning? The light in the darkness. He's come to restore all things, to make all things new. He's stepped into our rebellious, sinful, fallen world set for destruction. He took on himself our sin, the punishment that we deserved. He wiped the slate clean so we don't have to perish. Who's in charge of history? Jesus is in charge of history. And right at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, we see somebody else who's feeling really overwhelmed, actually. John, in Revelation, he sees this big vision of heaven, and he sees this scroll, and he's brokenhearted. It says he weeps. He's so overwhelmed as he asks, is anyone worthy? Who's in charge of history? And I'm going to invite Goff up now to read Revelation chapter 5 to us and just help us to see this glorious picture that we have.
You don't need me to do this. You've done so brilliantly, Dan. Stay, do what you like, but we're going to break bread in a moment. So you've done the heavy lifting. But as it becomes the end of this book of Daniel, most people avoid this chapter that this man has so brilliantly opened up to us this morning. It's going to take us into Revelation. That's where we'll be going as we begin to finish this series. And there we read, John, I saw the right hand of the one who sat on the throne and a scroll, writing on both sides. It's sealed with 7 seals. I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, who is worthy to break the seals? Who's in charge of history? Who's going to roll out God's purposes? How can it happen in a dark world? How's it all going to come about? And I wept because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look inside. And then one of the elders said to me, oh, don't weep. See, the Lion, the tribe of Judah, the root of David, he has triumphed. And he is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. And then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, circled by the 4 living creatures. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll And when he'd taken it, the 4 living creatures, they turned and the 24 elders, they fell down before the Lamb. Each one of them had a harp. Musicians, you're up, good. And they're holding golden bowls, incense. They're the prayers of God's people. And they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll of history, the outworking of all the happenings on the earth, to open its scroll because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God people from every tribe, language and people and nation. And you've made them to be a kingdom, priests to serve our God. And they're going to reign on the earth. And then I looked and heard the number of many, many angels, thousands upon thousands, 10,000 upon 10,000. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory. And I heard every creature in earth and heaven and under the earth saying, and the sea, and all saying, to him who sits on the throne and the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. Is that good news? Is that wonderful? And one of the other prophets looking down the years, Isaiah caught a glimpse, and he said, who on earth's going to believe our message? Who's going to believe it? He was despised and rejected. He was a man of suffering, familiar with pain, and he took our pain and he bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgression. Isn't this astonishing? He was crushed for our iniquities. Punishment that brought us peace was put on him. And by his wounds, we are healed. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Folks, that's where we're going now. We're going to break bread. We're going to break bread. And if I hope this morning, I hope none of you take for granted what Jesus has done for you. Tom referred to that earlier. I hope you don't take it for granted. I think we'll have to burst into song here.